Okay, so now we're going to take a very brief historical look at the land sector, land tenure and property rights, and how these different systems have evolved over time. So to begin, people have always depended upon land and resources for our basic needs, whether that's for food, for shelter, for water, as well as for our emerging wants, the things that we would like to produce to make our lives more complete. People have also always had rules about who can access land, for what purposes, and within what time frame. So sometimes people will think that in the distant past there really were no rights or no rules that decided who had access to land. But in fact, as ethnographers and anthropologists have looked around the world, they found time and again that fairly complex systems of rules have been developed to govern access to those resources. What's important to note here is that the need for rules and the nature of the rules themselves evolve over time as people's relationship to nature, to land, to natural resources change. So nature, wealth that flows from the use of nature and natural resources, and power, the power that comes from allocating rights to use those resources or capturing the benefits associated with those resources, those three issues are inextricably linked. What drives change in the rules related to land? Well, these changes happen because conditions surrounding people change. So in most places, what you will see if you take a close look is that rules about land have changed in the past and continue to change today. These changes over the course of time are driven by interrelated factors, and here are a couple of them. Sometimes it's technology that drives changes related to the rules governing land use or land access. You could think, for example, of barbed wire. The invention of barbed wire in the United States changed the way farmers interacted with each other in the American West, changed rulemaking around property rights in the American West in the 19th century. One of the most important changes that affects rules related to property use and access is population. As populations rise, pressure on land increases. It tends to be the case that people transition, or societies transition, from an environment where property rights are held in common by many people to an environment where property rights are held in a more individual or family-based manner. Because the costs associated with holding rights communally becomes very high as populations rise. The value of land rises, and people look for ways to internalize the rising value of those lands and resources. Sometimes changes in rules related to property are driven by changing values or changing ideologies. An example of that would be the rise of socialist states in the 20th century, the way in which people living inside those communities dealt with property changed dramatically because the ideologies governing those societies changed. So these changes happen unevenly across time and space. In some societies, you may see very little change for a long period of time because populations don't rise and new technologies aren't introduced. In other places, you may see changes happening quite dramatically and quite quickly. A simplified view of how these changes tend to occur over time, though, would look something like the following. A typical transition would be from an environment where there are customary rights to land, governed by informal governance systems, institutions, and leaders, to an environment where there's a statutory system governing access to, use over, transfer of land and property rights. And for those of you who come from common law jurisdictions, your societies have experienced this change from a system where there was quite a lot of customary rulemaking around land and resources to a system where now we largely have a statutorily based system related to land. We also tend to see a transition from informal systems, that is non-state-based systems, to more formalized systems governing land and resource use and allocation. So from a system where local leaders, traditional authorities, may govern the use of these resources to a system where the government, a formal government, is responsible for those systems. And again, usually a transition from groups controlling access to rights over transfers of land to a system where there's more individualized rights to land and other kinds of property. USAID oftentimes refers to, and so do other donors for that matter, refers to a continuum of land rights. And throughout the course, over the course of the next 14 weeks, other speakers will be talking with you about the continuum of land rights. And on this slide, you can see what we mean by the continuum of land rights. The continuum begins, in a sense, at the one side of the slide where you see informal land rights. Again, usually rights that are managed, controlled, decided by groups of people who are not members of a formal government, all the way over to the other side of the slide where we have formalized land rights, normally contained in statutory law, enforced by government officials. And you can see in between, from the spread of informal rights to formal land rights, that there are important points here where people may perceive that they have greater or lesser security over their rights. And you can see that we've also listed different kinds of ways that people can hold rights. Either they can occupy land or they can have a more formalized leasehold over land. And that kind of explains to you that in the informal system, you may occupy land without a piece of paper. In a more formal system, those pieces of paper may become very important and would be reflected in things like deeds of sale or leaseholds. I want to walk through a few definitions with you now. USAID often uses the phrase land tenure and property rights, sometimes condensed to the acronym LTPR, when labeling programs and describing the tools that it uses in this area. What is land tenure? It's not a phrase that's particularly common, especially if you're from the United States. This isn't a phrase that we use very often. John Bruce, one of the leading land tenure scholars, defined land tenure as the rights and obligations of the holder of land. A tenure system is all the types of tenure that are recognized by a national and/or a local system of law taken together. So it's a pretty broad set of rules governing your rights and abilities to use, transfer, allocate land with regard to or vis-a-vis other people. What are property rights? So John Bruce again defines property as a set of rights and responsibilities concerning a thing. So property is also the term for the thing itself. This gets a little bit confusing. The thing, when we talk about property rights, and we're basically talking about real property, the thing is the land itself, any buildings or immovable objects that are built on the land. But we also have different categories of property called movable property, and those are things like a car, could be something like a pen or my computer. And then we have a final category of property that's called intangible property, and that includes items like patents or ideas. A copyright that you hold is a kind of intellectual property that is at the same time intangible. You can't put your fingers on or wrap your arms around what exactly that copyright is. So then a lot of times you'll, if you're working in this sector, hear phrases and terms like concession or usufructuary rights. Sometimes you may hear people talking about quieting a title. Sometimes you'll hear about customary proprietorship. A very common term and very important in the development sector is the phrase the commons. So it's important to recognize that there are, in this sector, like every development sector, a lot of specific language and terms that help us to define and to categorize the work that we're doing in the land sector. It may be important for you, or it may be useful for you to know that the FAO, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, has published a multilingual thesaurus that you can refer to, and that's included in your recommended readings, that can help you get over some of the confusion that you may feel at the beginning of this course when you're being introduced to new words and phrases that are unfamiliar to you.